CNHAG had a wood stove national summit last November. The background to this is, as you guys probably know, particulate matter is very bad for your respiratory and cardiovascular health. Exposure to it can cause heart attacks, asthma attacks, and chronic exposure has been shown in children to reduce your resistance to respiratory viruses and so on. In the wintertime, wood stoves, residential wood stoves, account for approximately 65% of Canada's PM2.5 ambient air, in the ambient air. And surprisingly, not a lot is being done about this particular issue. You might not remember, there's a few young heads in here, you might not remember that in 1999, the Intergovernmental Working Group on Residential Wood Stove Combustion was formed under the then Canada-wide standards processes for PM2.5. And it was an FPT and municipal government process that was intended to set priorities and to create some action under a variety of topic areas for wood stove smoke. They wanted to improve the CSA standards for wood stoves. They wanted to develop a national regulation, build national public education programs, and where possible, have change-out programs. Since that time, since the early 2000s, there have been a few actions, and that's all. So we did have an updated emissions standard for our wood stoves, and they're currently re-reviewing it now because EPA has changed the American standards. There was a creation of a number of documents, particularly by CCME, for example, best practice guidelines. And Environment Canada developed a document that showed model bylaws that people could take to, if they could make their own municipal or provincial regulations for wood stoves. And some communities, for example, in British Columbia and Montreal, did actually implement some municipal bylaws. There have been a few wood stove change-out campaigns, but as I say, this problem continues throughout Canada. As you might imagine, it's a hotspot problem because wood stoves tends to settle around. Wood stove smoke is an issue in communities, and sometimes rural, sometimes urban, and often affected by weather. And also the geographical location of the community. If you're in a valley, for example, you have more of a wood stove smoke than if you're higher up. So last November, with funding from Health Canada, the Lung Association, and the Canadian Network for Human Health and the Environment, convened a national summit. It was very small. It had about 15 perhaps participants. We wanted to keep it small because we were bringing together people who knew about this issue already. We weren't giving presentations on health effects, for example. We wanted people who really knew a lot about this particular issue. The participants included federal, provincial participants, Natural Resources Canada, ECCC, Health Canada, some provincial departments of environment, some municipal representatives, some medical officers of health, some advocates, community advocates, the Hearth Patio Barbecue Association, and so a real wide diversity of input that we sat down for a day and looked at why aren't we making any action on this? What are the barriers to taking action? And what are the solutions that could work around those barriers for taking action on wood stove smoke? The topic areas that we had discussions around included FPT regulations and policies, and municipal governments regulations and policies, wood stove change-out campaigns, public education campaigns, the need for scientific health information, the need for a solution for heating in remote communities and when the power goes out, and for low socioeconomic families. We also discussed the problem of the collision between air quality and climate change solutions, as some of you probably know, if you're trying to mitigate for climate change, burning wood or using renewables is one of the good things to do. And some places are turning to burning wood as a climate change mitigation strategy. And so we need to find a way to make people realize that burning wood is not climate neutral and it's not a good solution when you consider air quality. So the overarching actions that are needed to create a strategy for this particular issue is summarized very briefly in this page here. It's boiling down a whole day's conversation into a few paragraphs. So every little word in here would take a lot of time to implement. So we need to create an FPT and municipal government with stakeholders committee to determine the following. We need to allocate the right jurisdiction for the right action. So whether we're talking about research, bylaws, public education, this sort of thing, we need to identify which jurisdiction is best placed to take that action. We need a research strategy because there are not many localized studies on this. And the key to action, I think, is getting political will changed. And if you can put yourself in the mindset of a politician, they usually need a few key things. They need some science to quote, and they need public support for an action they're going to take. And although we have pretty good science out in BC on this issue, local or even provincial evidence is lacking. So that science agenda would be a challenge to do for a variety of reasons, but we do think that that evidence base is important to change political will. We need mechanisms, as I said, to prevent climate change mitigation actions from increasing air pollution. We need a place to house data and guidelines and reports. Early thinking was that might be the BC Centre for Environmental Health. And the approach that you take for those things, as I said, the starting point, I think, is changing political will. So some of the key things that they need are research and public support. And public support comes from awareness and education. I think if you were to ask the regular Canadian, they would think that they love to burn wood, they love the smell of it, it's cheap, it's cozy, it works when the power is out, and what's wrong with it, sort of thing. When you explain to them the flip side of the health risk to their family or to their neighbors, maybe they would start to think that maybe perhaps we do need to have a different solution here. And the other challenge with this particular issue is because it is such a community-based problem, you really need different levels of government to work in this area. You need people from the municipalities, from the provinces, and from different federal government agencies to work together to address this particular issue. And those of you that work in the federal or provincial governments or have worked with them, you know how siloed those government agencies can be and how difficult it is to cross-reference them in the work that they do. Because they're all they're all working under different acts. That's their driver, so it can be a challenge. I think the most strategic first step that we came up with was to make this tri-level government and multi-stakeholder committee to work on a variety of mechanisms to clarify which government agency should have which role and what issues should be addressed at each of those levels. And the priorities that came out of this meeting, that this committee that we recommend be created, are the following, and it's 2 pages of priorities that really distills this full day of consultation that we had. So we need health to be the driver of the conversation here. In terms of public education, we have to make people realize that their family health is as important as their heating solutions and their enjoyment of a wood stove, for example. We need to change social norms. People will tell you that burning wood is a Canadian thing to do, and it's done all across Canada. So we need to sort of change that track a little bit. And we need to target the language when we talk to different people to achieve the right action. Those of you that do public education and engagement understand that the message and the way you deliver the message is key to getting a little bit of traction. So we need to operationalize what we know. We know we need to do things like public education outreach, change out campaigns, better laws and regulations. And we have good examples of having done this in the past. If you look at how far we've come with tobacco regulations federally and then provincially. And remember back when we first had smoke-free places or smoking bylaws, they started in municipalities to ban smoking in restaurants and bars. So sometimes the municipalities can play a regulatory role here too. So we've got a lot of good examples to use in the tobacco world, especially if you're looking for regulatory change. And if you're looking to one step down from regulatory change and thinking of going the code or the standard sort of level of action, it's not a law, but a best practices, for example, then you could look at how we do the building code. When the federal government sets the building code best practices and the codes, those get adopted as codes, but not laws, but as codes in the provinces. So there's good processes to follow if we need a pathway that's already carved for us so that we could translate to some Woodstone actions. So we need a regulatory framework, we need to create laws and policies, and that will require public consultation, of course, education. If you look at the places that implemented bylaws for residential wood stoves, there are a number in BC, and the City of Montreal has achieved a lot of good things there. Those take a lot of work before we can even get to the stage of creating that bylaw. You need a lot of engagement and consultation. And the second page of priorities, to create a research and monitoring strategy that will motivate politicians and support regulations and policies. Doing research on wood stoves is challenging because the exposure occurs in small communities. Those of you that know epidemiological research understand you need a big population to get an epi study going. So you need enough exposure data and so on. And sometimes the way that health data is collected, it makes it difficult to do these studies in small communities. So we might just have to go with more survey type of approaches as opposed to epidemiological studies. We need a solution for inexpensive and secure heating for remote communities and during power outages. We need to deal with this climate change clash with air quality issue. We need a national solution for where to house the data, as I said. And we need to account for and recognize and account for the differences between a rural problem and an urban problem in this particular issue. And I'll go through this quickly too, because as I say, there's not a lot of time. But this slide teases out the different types of things that could be done at the federal, provincial, or municipal level. For example, at the federal level, we could create a regulation that all new installations need to have be a certified stove. Currently, you can't put that regulation in SEPA, but we know that SEPA is currently undergoing review. You can put that regulation under the Hazardous Products Act, but some people might feel that putting a nice cozy wood stove under Hazardous Products Act might not be the place where they want to put it, so that needs to be looked at. The federal government could mandate labeling at the point of sale to explain the health impacts and the best use practices. The federal government could fund change-out and education programs. They could offer tax credit for replacement of dirtier stoves, and they could undertake public opinion surveys through Health Canada or StatsCan. The provincial governments, our committee really thought that the provincial government should regulate wood stoves in their provincial laws, wherever is the best place for it. That would make it not necessary so much to have a bylaw with every single community, which is time-consuming and very onerous. But provincial laws can only mention a few things. BC is the only province that references wood stove smoke in their provincial laws, and all that they say is you must use a certified wood stove and you must only burn clean, dry wood. That's all they say.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas there can be a lot of other things that could be nuanced, perhaps, at the municipal level to deal with more local issues. And sometimes it's effective if you do have to start using bylaws at a municipal level for clusters of communities to move together, because implementing municipal bylaws takes a lot of community engagement and buy-in, and that's a big hill to climb. Once again, when you consider that a lot of people have wood stoves and they love them. So most of what our committee talked about has already been talked about previously, but just not acted on. So we'd really like to get action on this issue. If you're looking for stuff to read or further information, you could have a look at CCME, the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment Code of Practice for Residential Wood Burning Appliances. Also, if Lance shares these slides, you can click on these links and look at a great summary of a workshop that was done in 2002, which pretty much came to the same conclusions that our workshop did. We expanded the conversation a little bit into the climate change issue and the need for a solution for remote communities and during power outages, but the other parts are pretty much the same. And I don't know if you can, I think maybe you can find this online. I had a quick look and couldn't find it, but I have a copy of it if you want it. You can email me. In 2002, there was a great article written called Residential Wood Combustion, written by Linda Loris and Chantal Duham with Environment Canada. I think Chantal she was, I don't know if she's still working with Environment Canada. And so those give you a much bigger picture of the type of stuff that we talked about. And we're hoping that we can get a committee going to actually start putting the wheels under some of these actions at the different government levels. Fingers crossed. I'm wondering whether the $1 billion that's going to the coronavirus might hive off some money that might be available for something like this at the federal level, but we'll see. So happy to answer any questions they have.
Thanks, Barb. Just one question. Can anyone hear well? Like just because we have the option for a mic, but they told us we didn't need it for the room. I just wanted to make sure before we continue. Anyways, just bring it up.
So,
Yeah.
I'll go to your, okay. So that we're doing questions.
I'm happy to.
We're going to do some questions. Does anyone have any questions for Barb while we get all the set up?
Yeah, sure. I have a question.
Sure.
What's something that we can do today or next week in a friend's or a family's wood stove or your own wood stove? Is there some kind of easy retrofit that can help to not decarbonize it fully or bring down the PM 2.5? But is there something that you can get a pretty good step in the right direction on this? Is there an easy first step, low-hanging fruit or anything?
The first thing is to make sure you're using a certified stove, and having it maintained is key, because even the certified stove, the catalytic converter breaks down over time. And the other thing is to just burn clean, dry wood, hot, with a hot fire. Those are the two key pieces of advice somebody who has a wood stove.
Cool. Thank you.
I'm only going to just add something. I'm just not sure if you're aware that, so our federal government offers rebates to people installing new wood and pellet stoves currently in the province of Nova Scotia. I'm not sure about other provinces, But there are rebates that are available to encourage people to install wood stoves and pellet stoves in Nova
In
Scotia.
Nova Scotia, and that's true through some energy efficiency programs.
Yes.
Yeah. New Brunswick used to have that, but they took it off.
They took it off, did they?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Robolt. A lot of you know me from when I work in environment. I'm currently working with Lance in Health Canada and jumped at the opportunity to come here today and see a lot of familiar faces. I've worked a little bit with AIR now, but not as much as I probably would like to. And I miss all of you dearly. I'm here to introduce Dr. Eldona Wojcik, Associate Professor cross-appointed between environmental science and astronomy and physics at St. Mary's University, with research interests in situ and remote measurements of atmospheric trace gases related to air quality and climate, pollution transport, and air-sea gas flux measurements. Although I'm speaking about the Halifax, the name, Halifax 2 campaign overview. And I'll get started. Thank you.
First, I'd like to thank Lance and Health Canada for putting together this forum, that it brings us all regionally together. That's a great opportunity. So these titles get kind of created in haste. So my title was Halifax 2 Campaign Overview, some VOCs and FTIR. And then it appeared in the program and I was like, oh my God. Acronyms, do I have to talk about all that? Anyways, I can't take credit for the cleverness of Halifax. This stands for Halifax Fog and Air Quality Study. That was designed in a maternity sleepless haze of Rachel Chang, who's a researcher at Dalhousie. And some of her stuff is going to be in this talk. She couldn't be here today because she's still on maternity and she shouldn't be here today for that reason. I always like to put this kind of stuff first so that it doesn't get lost last. Morgan is here today and Ian is here today. They're my students. We have lots of sponsors over the years. We've been working with DMD as well. And St. Mary's has put a lot of money into my work as well. So, before I tell you about the campaigns, I am going to bring you back down to some real details and tell you a little bit about my measurement technique for trace gases. So we're making a real shift from PM to trace gases now. And then I will talk about the two campaigns. There's actually Halifax 1 and 2. One happened a year ago in Dockyards, or a year and a half ago now, or two almost. And then Halifax 2 was at St. Mary's. And then I'll of course show some results and say what's happening in the future. So this is the gory picture of our spectrometer with an IR source that sends radiation out through a telescope to the atmosphere. It goes and hits some mirrors, comes back into the telescope, and then, oh, the laser's dying. Or is it? Yeah, the laser's dying. That's fine. So if you don't like looking at this kind of stuff, it basically looks like this in physical life. A spectrometer generates IR, which a telescope sends out through the atmosphere to some mirrors, and then back to a detector. And so that lets us record an infrared absorption spectrum. This is our raw data. And this is spectral intensity on the y-axis versus wave number, which is a proxy for frequency in weird units. And the areas of very little infrared intensity here that you can see most clearly are absorptions due to water and CO2, the primary IR absorbers in the atmosphere. So that's our raw data. And from this, we get trace gas concentrations based on, oh, now I'll have to coordinate. Oh, no, that's not a pointer, because if I have to coordinate two hands, that would be very tricky. So, you zoom in on a part of this spectrum where trace gases do their thing, and we're able to fit a whole bunch of different trace gases together. Usually we have to fit them together because there's no region in the spectrum where one gas just sits ready for you to detect. So you have to do a bunch of them together. So this is a target retrieval for ozone with what we call its interference. And it's a good fit, as shown by the residual here, which is always within 1%. That's what we're shooting for. So this is how we get our data. Now, why would we measure with it? This is called an open path FTIR technique. So why would you measure with this? Well, of course, you can measure gases for process studies, pollution monitoring, and satellite validation. The advantages of this that you are measuring many gases at the same time with one instrument. Can't talk, it's hard to. The spectra, once you record them, they're archived forever. You can go back and analyze them for whatever you want. And the 1 ppb detection limits are in some cases an advantage, in other cases it's too low. And the open path itself has some advantages where you're getting away from, say, being too close to a given point source because you're averaging over a larger distance, so your measurement may be more spatially representative. Okay, so the retrievals are tolerant of some fog and rain. I'm going to skip that because I don't want to take up only my time and not more. So with that instrumentation, or that was one piece of equipment that was deployed at the Halifax 1 campaign at the dockyards. And so the dockyards are here, just north of the McDonald Bridge. And this pink line in both maps is showing our open path, roughly. So we actually put our spectrometer on the dockyard side and our retroreflector on the Dartmouth side. And on the right here is, what the shipping traffic is doing in this channel, which is kind of cool. So we're going to get some ship plume intercepts from this kind of positioning. And in real life, in Google Earth, this was Google Earth perspective. So we had our spectrometer here and the retro here on this military jetty. And it was all super secure, and like we couldn't get in to get, look at our data or instruments a lot of the time. It felt pretty cool to be working with the military of this, who has supported us greatly in this work. So on the Halifax side, we had our spectrometer. We also had an air pointer acknowledgement to Jung Sung Kim for both of his air pointers that we've been using for the last little while. Caro and some meteorology instrumentation, Vaisala and Rachel contributed the ACSM, so aerosol chemical speciation monitor, so we had some aerosol information as well. And in Dartmouth, we had the retroreflectors, which is the fancy word for the mirror, another air pointer, and some more meteorology. Okay, so the D&D gave us this shack to work out of where we put the telescope and the spectrometer telescope shooting IR out through an open window. And the air pointer looks like this in action, and this is our view. If you stand where the spectrometer is sending the IR across the harbor and back, you're kind of looking for, maybe here actually. That's how far it's going, so you can't even see the retro. So technically it's interesting as well, but that's another talk. So the path can be fog filled like this, and we can measure through some of this, a fair bit of this actually. You'd think IR would be attenuated, or everything would be attenuated, but IR is not attenuated as much as visible is. And this is the ship filled path, so sometimes this happens. And so when a big ACL ship goes through, we can't measure through that. So that's actually breaking our data, which is fine. And this is what the mirrors look like with Cameron operating them. You don't need two, but we just have to. We only need one of them to send your signal. And this is the air pointer on the Dartmouth side. And this is an example of the air pointer ozone data. So the two different traces are the air pointer on the Halifax side and then the Dartmouth side. And so there's some question around how will those measurements differ when they're separated by 600 meters almost. And they actually have a mean difference of almost nil. Very little. They're within 0.93 parts per billion of one another. It has a mean difference. And that is interesting. That's pretty big homogeneity across a very busy environment. And this, oh yeah, Morgan Coteries is one of those where you can't see this axis, but so this is, yeah, I can't see this axis. This is August 10th to August 30th. So this is a month of ozone concentrations. And you see it's going up and down. Almost to zero, so these are these titration events where NOx is being trapped in the boundary layer and all of the ozone is getting titrated on a fairly regular basis. So that's kind of our first check. The next step is to throw the FTIR data on this, which is the pink curve. And there's good agreement with the open path FTIR data when it's available. I'm working on some quantifications of that still. From this campaign, while the data analysis is still very much happening, we have shipping pollution intercepts.